Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. This is the first of what I would like to see become a series of videos on sumo data. I'm a big fan of data, of analytics, of finding patterns and correlations in numbers and statistics that will help us get an idea of what will happen in the future based on what's happened in the past. So with that said, let's start our series with a look at Meisei. As you probably already know if you're watching this, in the Haru Basho 2022, Meisei went 1-14. No one has ever gone 0-15 in Makuuchi, only in Juryo, so 1-14 is legendarily bad. It was so profoundly terrible that I brought up this chart during my Haru Basho recap to show how few wrestlers in the history of sumo have managed to go 1-14 in the Makuuchi division at a rank high enough that during the next basho they stayed in Makuuchi. One thing I did bring up in defense of Meisei, or at least in defense of Meisei's future, was that every Rikishi for the last 40 years, with the exception of Daishoho in January of 1997 who dropped out after 4 fights, everyone who went 1-14 followed it up with a Kachikoshi. Now, they were all much lower rank at that time, but the lower level of competition still led to success. They weren't complete failures, they still could get some work done. And maybe Meisei will follow the same pattern. I'd like to believe so, but something was bothering me. He had been so consistent for so long, and I didn't know if any of these guys were. So I went back and I looked at how they had done in the tournament before they went 1-14, and this is what I found. Now, it's worth noting that before 1958, the sumo wrestlers fought fewer than 6 bashos per year, so the nature of how often they need to compete, how often they have to deal with injury and such, was different back then. So if we eliminate everybody in that era, every single person, until you get to Ikkyoi, the last person who went 1-14 in Makuuchi at a high rank, every single one had a Kachikoshi before their 1-14 record. Now, you can look at a lot of these guys and say, well, look, they had huge jumps in rank. You know, he only went 9-6, but he went all the way from Maegashira 9 to Maegashira 1. There's a lot of 10-4, 6-1, 6-1, 7-2, 5-1. 10-2, 11-2, because these guys had even better records, 10-5, 12-3. Maybe they simply weren't cut out for that level of competition. After all, Spiffy, weren't you talking shit on Ishiura, saying that at Maegashira 5 he wasn't going to do very well either? And that's entirely true. I did say Ishiura was going to get his ass handed to him at Maegashira 5 because he simply never fought at that level, and there was no reason to think he was going to do very well. But all the same, it was worth looking through the histories of these guys and seeing if we could find any patterns. Were these people who never had a high rank before their 1-14? Obviously, with Iwakaze, he was already Komusubi, so we can't say that about him, but what about everybody else? Or were these people who were used to being at high rank and just for some reason had a really terrible tournament? Were they prone to big swings in record? What can we find out by looking at what they've done in the past? I'm sure you see all those tabs at the top of the screen. And yes, those are the records of the different wrestlers on this list. So let's go through these records and see if any of these wrestlers can be instructive with regards to what we might expect from Meisei in the future. First, let's remind ourselves that for the past 2 years or so, Meisei has been a model of consistency. After coming off an injury, he went 7-8 at Maegashira 17, but then he won a Yusho at Juryo 1, and then had 7 consecutive Kachikoshis in Maegashira, getting him all the way to Sekiwake. Now, in his second tournament at Sekiwake, he went 7-8, which is really not that far off of 8-7. That's why you don't want to just go 8-7, you want to give yourself some breathing room, but it's still very consistent. The 5-10 he had in January looked like an aberration until we got to March. So, is there anyone else like that in the history books? Iwakaze would certainly seem to qualify. At Maegashira 7, he had a Jun Yusho at 12-3, made it to Komusubi, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 consecutive Kachikoshis after his Jun Yusho. A 7-8 record at Sekiwake bumped him down to Komusubi, but then he went 8-7 and 9-6 before his Komusubi record of 1-14. It came very much from out of nowhere. There was nothing in the last couple years of performance that would suggest he was capable of doing anywhere near this badly, just like Meisei. Tsuneneshiki was nothing like those two. He struggled to stay in Maegashira for the most part, occasionally getting to higher ranks, but not doing very well when he managed it. Maegashira 3, 3 and 12. 8 and 7, 7 and 8, 7 and 8, then he had his 1 and 14 at Maegashira 7. Dropped back to Juryo, made it back to Maegashira, and then when he made it to Maegashira 1, which was the highest level of his career, that was another 1 in 14 record. So he very much rode the struggle bus for most of his career. He's not a good example. Unfortunately, most of the rest of the list consists of wrestlers who had, let's just say, not the best records leading up to their 1 in 14s. Like with Kairyu-Yama, he had a string of 5 7 and 8s in a row before he got a Kachikoshi and then went 1 in 14. He also had 3 5 and 10 records within the 3 years before his 1 in 14. Waka Futase was no stranger to really terrible records, although he did manage to get some pretty high ranks in his career. He was 4 and 11 at Komusubi, 5 and 10 at Maegashira 4, 3 and 12 at Komusubi, 2 and 13 at Maegashira 3, before he ended up with a 1 in 14 at Maegashira 1. All of those happened within less than a 3-year stretch. Kamino Fuji was a longtime Sekawake wrestler who was getting near the end of his career when his 1 in 14 happened. He had done very well through his career, had some 5 and 10s, but also had some 11 and 4s. But as he was getting near the end, due to injury and whatnot, he had a 3 and 12 at Komusubi, 5 and 10 at 2, 4 and 11 at Maegashira 5, some okay records, until he got a 1 in 14 at Maegashira 4, a 3 and 12 at Maegashira 12, and dropped to Juryo and soon retired. It's worth noting that he wasn't that old. He was just in his early 30s when his body started to fail him and he had these terrible records. Meisei is only 26. If he is injured, that will hopefully not be the case for very long. Hopefully he can recover. But this is what happens when a guy is physically falling apart. Kaneshiro, fighting at that time as Tochi Hikari, was a pretty good wrestler. He spent some time in the Sanyaku ranks, not a lot, had a couple of Jun-Yu shows from the middle ranks. At the time he had his 1 in 14, he was about 30, and had some okay tournaments before that. The previous year, he had gone from 6 and 9 to 9 and 6 and everything in between. But at that point in time, he had really started struggling at the higher ranks. After a 7 and 8 at Maegashira 2, he went 3 and 12 at Maegashira 3, 6 and 9 at 4, 4 and 11 at 2 before his 1 and 14 at Maegashira 1. After that, he continued to struggle at the upper ranks. 4 and 11 at Maegashira 4, 5 and 10 at 5. After that, he was basically down in Juryo and retired relatively soon after that. Hiroshima is an interesting case. At Komusubi in January of 1989, he went 1 and 14. Before that, he had a 10 and 5 at Maegashira 6, which not too bad, and went 5 and 10 at Maegashira 2. But before that, he had a string of tournaments of over a year where he had neither 10 wins nor 10 losses. However, he did previously show something of a propensity for struggling in the higher ranks. He went 3 and 12 at Sekiwake, 4 and 11 at Maegashira 1, 4 and 11 at Maegashira 2, 3 and 12 at Maegashira 2. And while we're going back 3.5 years at this point, and 3.5 years is usually, I think, too far back in order to really tell how a wrestler is going to perform, it's worth noting just how consistently he struggled when he got to that level. So this wasn't really that much of a surprise either. Takano Fuji was another wrestler who showed a tendency to struggle once he got into that upper echelon. He went 2 and 13 at Maegashira 1 in 1988, 3 and 12 at Maegashira 3 in 1989, 2 and 13 at Maegashira 1 in 1990. 2 months later, he made it to Komusubi after going 11 and 4 at Maegashira 9 and went 2 and 13 again. Eventually, he made it back up to Maegashira 2, and that's where his 1 and 14 record happened. A year later, he was in Juryo and retired. This guy getting a 1 and 14 record at too high of a rank, not a shock at all. Daishoho is another wrestler who never really did that well at the upper ranks. Outside of one 9 and 6 record relatively early in his career at Maegashira 1, he had a lot of very poor records once he got into those upper ranks. 3 and 12 at Maegashira 5, 5 and 10 at Komusubi, 5 and 10 at Maegashira 3, 2 and 13 at Komusubi, and then he had his 1 and 14 at Maegashira 1. He was probably falling apart at that point because after that, at Maegashira 14, he dropped out due to injury, missed the next tournament, and never got out of Juryo again. Shikishima very simply got his ass beat when he got too high up the Banzuke. 3 and 12 at Maegashira 1, 4, 9 and 2 at Maegashira 3, and his 1 and 14 at Maegashira 2. Follow that up a few months later with the 3 and 12 at Maegashira 4, and that's pretty much all he ever did when he was in the top 4 Maegashira ranks. Kotoryu was another wrestler where it wasn't really a surprise to see him struggle when he got to the higher ranks. He was 4 and 11 at Maegashira 5, 5 and 10 at Maegashira 5, 6 and 9 at Maegashira 1, and that was about as good as it got for him. 5 and 10 at Maegashira 3, and then he had his 1 and 14 at Maegashira 1. The rest of his career made all of that seem not at all surprising in retrospect either. Even though he kept getting up to Maegashira 1, Maegashira 3, he never found much success once he was at those levels. Kyoku Shuzan is a wrestler who spent an awful lot of time in the high Maegashira ranks and even won basho at Komusubi for someone who tended to struggle so much when he was actually up there. Just in the couple of years before he had his 1 and 14 in July of 2002, he had a 5 and 10 at Maegashira 1, a 5 and 10 at Maegashira 4. We're going to ignore the 5 and 10 at Maegashira 8 because that's not even high rank. A 4 and 11 at Maegashira 3, and a 1, 12 and 2 at Maegashira 5, which could have been another 1 and 14 if he had just shown up for the last few days. On top of that, his 1 and 14 was so bad, it's the closest anyone's ever come to an 0 and 15, considering that his one win was a walkover. He did not actually beat anyone during that basho. So is this a surprise? I don't know. I think you would have to have been there and been a fan of the sport at the time. I do know that he didn't have anywhere near Meisei's consistency, so he's not really a good analog. Unlike many of the wrestlers on this list, Hokuto Riki at least had one really good tournament in the high Maegashira ranks, going 13 and 2 with a Junyu show at Maegashira 1. He then followed that up with a 3 and 12 at Sekiwake, a 5 and 10 at Maegashira 6, and then very often on records all the way until he was 2 and 13 at Maegashira 1, and 2 months later, 1 and 14 at Maegashira 2. So that really can't be considered a surprise either. Tamakasuga appears on this list due to injury and age. Although he was a mid to high Maegashira wrestler for most of his career, for the last few years before his 1 and 14 record, he had been bouncing between low Maegashira and Juryo back and forth. Just to show how much he had been struggling, less than a year before his 1 and 14 record, he went 5 and 10 at Juryo 2. So when he went 11 and 4 at Maegashira 12, got bumped up to Maegashira 4, and everything fell apart, it wasn't much of a shock. As if to prove that his days in the higher ranks were done, he had 2 more cracks at a top 5 ranking, but at Maegashira 5 he went 4 and 11, and a year later, at Maegashira 5 again, he went 4 and 11 again. In Homasho, we have a wrestler who didn't always struggle at the highest ranks, even around the time when he went 1 and 14. Now, he had dropped from Maegashira 2 to 15 due to missing a tournament from injury, but before that, yeah, he went 3 and 12 at Maegashira 1, but immediately before that he had gone 8 and 7 at Maegashira 1. Okay, before that he went 5 and 10 at Maegashira 1, but he had gone 11 and 4 at Maegashira 5, which is, a reasonably high rank. And after his 1 and 14 in 2009, he missed a tournament at Maegashira 2, came back some 7 and 8s at the higher ranks. Yeah, he had a 3 and 12, but then he had a 10 and 5. So he usually struggled at high ranks, but not always, and was in fact capable of putting up some pretty good scores. So was it a complete shock at that time that he was 1 and 14 in a tournament? Maybe not completely, but it certainly didn't fit with a record of constantly sucking when he got too high in rank. Aaron is actually a pretty interesting case relative to all of these other wrestlers on the list, whereas many of them struggled over and over and over again at the high ranks before their 1 and 14 record. What we see from him is that he only had 1 tournament before that, and he was 4 and 11 at Maegashira 1. So it wasn't shocking that he did poorly at a high rank, but there was also almost no data to go on at that point. But then, 2 tournaments after he had that 1 in 14, he went 11 and 4 and got a Junyusho at the exact same rank, Maegashira 2. That's kind of wild. Now, as it turns out, later in his career, and by later I mean immediately afterwards, he started to do relatively poorly at the higher ranks again. But for one tournament, he made that 1 in 14 look very, 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 very strange. Sometimes sumo wrestlers are described as yo-yos. They go up the banzuke as they win until they hit their point of failure, then they have a bad record, they come back down, they get to a point where they can beat the competition, they have a winning record, they go back up, and they yo-yo up and down the ranks. Now, some guys manage to have consistent records around 8 and 7 at certain ranks for a long time, and so they don't move a lot. Ichinojo is not that man. Before he had his 1 in 14 record in 2015 at Maegashira 2, he had never scored a winning record at a rank Maegashira 4 or above. So in that respect, him doing poorly at Maegashira 2 was not a surprise. But there were probably a lot of people who saw all the 11 and 4s and 9 and 6s and stuff on his record at that point and thought, you know what, this is a guy who might be able to do something someday. As it turned out, he did have a Junyusho later at Maegashira 4, and 2 tournaments after that, he went 10 and 5 at Maegashira 4 again, but for the most part, he did tend to do poorly at the higher ranks, but not as much as most of the other guys on this list. So after all that, that really only leaves us with Iwakaze in the 1960s as an example of someone who was consistently pretty good before he went 1 in 14. So can we take anything from his example? I mean, not in a scientific way since he's only one guy. For what it's worth, for the most part, he stayed around the mid to high Maegashira ranks. He did go 12 and 3 at Maegashira 5, but when he got to Komusubi again, he was 4 and 11. When he got to Sekiwake again, he was 5 and 10. At Maegashira 2, he was 5 and 10. So it's possible that Meisei was just overperforming a bit, and now he's coming back down to his level. But the rank that he drops to due to the 1 in 14 isn't where he'll stay. He'll get above that. But again, that's one person. So I wanted to go deeper. I looked over Meisei's record again, and I saw that he had 7 consecutive Kachikoshis. That's not including the one that he got at Juryo 1 where he won the Yusho in July of 2020. So if he had 7 consecutive Kachikoshis, how rare is that? How many guys have done that and not already been Ozeki or Yokozuna where those kind of performances are expected? I took a look and this is what I found. On 11 occasions this has happened by 10 different wrestlers. Takayumi has done it twice. Now, Koto Mitsuki is on here 6 times because he had a string of 12 consecutive Kachikoshis where he still didn't make it to Ozeki. And then at the end of that, he did make it to Ozeki. So then that stopped being counted on the list. What's noteworthy here is that Meisei started at Maegashira 13, went to 10, 7, 3, 2, and then in the 6th tournament on this run, made it to Komusubi. Everyone else on this list was a Sekiwake at that point. Everyone on the list except Hakuho was a Sekiwake in the tournament before that. Everyone on this list except Ichinojo and Hakuho were a Sekiwake in the tournament before that. So Meisei was working at lower ranks than basically everyone else here. And the only one who was even close to his rank, and in fact started below the rank that he did, was Hakuho, because that was when he was first going up the Banzuke. And we all know Hakuho is the GOAT, so he's kind of a special case. So who exactly do we have on this list? Well, we have Hakuho, we have Harumafuji, we have Kakuryu. So of the 10 wrestlers, we have 3 Yokozuna. We have Goeido, who was an Ozeki forever and famously just couldn't make it to Yokozuna. Takayumi, new Ozeki. Ama, who made it to Ozeki. And like I said, Koto Mitsuki, who made it to Ozeki at the end of a string of 12 Kachikoshis in the division. Curiously, Miyabiyama is kind of a special case. He went 10-5, 14-1, and 10-5. Now, at Sekiwake, with 34 wins in his last 3 tournaments, he should have been pushed to Ozeki, and probably anyone else would have been. Earlier in his career, he had been made an Ozeki after having his 33 wins in 3 tournaments, but not everybody agreed that he should be promoted. In fact, 3 of the 10 guys on the committee who made that decision said, no, we shouldn't promote him, but 7 said yes, so he went up. And it's probable that the reason he was not promoted here was because he had done poorly as an Ozeki previously, and they felt like he needed to prove something. So he ended up staying on the list and was able to get the 2 more Sekiwake winning records that kept him here for our purposes. So the first time Mitakeumi did this, he was Maegashira 1 and then just went straight to Sekiwake, but at no point, except for his Maegashira 1 tournament, did he manage more than 9 wins. That's why he never went to Ozeki this time. This second time, he finished with the 7th one being his 13-2 Yusho, and then he was pushed to Ozeki in the tournament after, and that was this past March. And then last but not least, we have Ichinojo, who is the 3rd lowest rank, or was the 3rd lowest rank at the start of this run of anybody on this list. By the 4th tournament, he was Komusubi, did make Sekiwake, and then was Sekiwake for a few tournaments. In the 8th one of this run, he went 6-9 and dropped again. Now, Ichinojo is a regular at the high ranks, so he's good. I don't know that anyone thinks he's necessarily Ozeki good, but he's not even 30 yet. It's still possible that he'll get there. So the reason I stretched this out to 10 tournaments is because Meisei's 1-14 came after a 5-10 and a 7-8, so he had 3 tournaments after the 7 Kachikoshis in a row. And I wanted to see how everybody on this list did in the 3 tournaments after they had their 7 straight Kachikoshis. So again, we need to eliminate a lot of Kotomitsukis because this was all part of the same string. So we take those out, and what are we left with? We've got Hakuho, who in Tournament 8 had to leave due to injury, and then ended up dropping to Maegashira 1, 9-6, Komusubi 1, 9-6. He did fine. Miyabiyama, he went 5-10, dropped out due to injury, but then came back at Maegashira 9, 9-6. Ama, Ozeki. Harumafuji, Ozeki. Kakuryu, Ozeki. Goedo, Ozeki, although he did have a 5-10 in there. Mitakeumi, he had to 7-8 at Sekiwake, but then went 9-6 at Komusubi, and then won his Yusho, his first Yusho, at 13-2 at Sekiwake. Ichinojo, 6-9, 6-9, ended up at Maegashira 4, but then went 14-1 and got a Jun Yusho. And of course, this last one we don't know yet because it's only been 1 tournament since Mitakeumi finished his most recent run of 7 consecutive winning records. So what does all this mean? For purposes of figuring out how Meisei is going to do in the future, it means almost nothing. Every single wrestler on this list did considerably better after his string of 7 Kachikoshis than Meisei did. This means one of 2 things must be true. Either Meisei is not on their level, which is entirely possible at this point, or Meisei might be able to get on the level of some of them at least, but he's hurt or for some other reason incapable of performing the way he's able to. As time goes by, we should figure out which one of those things is true, but if we want to figure out how he's likely to do in May, we have to figure out something a little more concrete with the data we have now. And that leaves us only one other option. Checking his bashos, looking at his record and seeing if there's something in the 8 and 7s that he got, especially the last few, that would suggest he's actually definitely good, or he maybe kind of squeaked by and isn't quite that Sekiwake level wrestler that he was able to maintain for a couple of tournaments. For completeness' sake, we'll look at 4 tournaments. The one where he went from Komusubi to Sekiwake, where he was able to hold on to Sekiwake, where he dropped from Sekiwake to Komusubi, and where he lost his Komusubi rank. Nagoya 2021, 8-7 record. Lost to Hakuho, not a shock. Lost to Hokuto Fuji. I mean, okay, Hokuto Fuji is good. A walkover against Takakeisho. Ooh, a walkover with an 8-7 record, that's dicey. Lost to Ichinojo. Beat Sekiwaki Takayasu. Beat Sekiwaki Takayumi. Lost to Wakataka Kage. Beat Daishoho. Lost to Shodai. Beat Takano Sho. Beat Kotoeko, who had no business being at that rank. Lost to Terano Fuji, who is the new Ozeki. Beat Kirabayama. Lost to Ura, who was on a roll, and was able to save his Kachikoshi by beating the definitely overmatched Kageyaki. So we look at all of these. 7-7 in actual fights. He had the walkover. Definitely had an easy win against Kageyaki. Definitely Kotoeko was not on his level, but he also had to get some good wins. You don't get to this level without being able to beat the guys at the top at least sometimes. But this one was close. This one was a little bit sketchy. But you know what? He got his 8 wins. That's all that counts. We move on. Aki 2021, Sekiwake. He immediately lost to 2 Maegashira wrestlers. I mean, Maegashira 2-1, and we know Kirabayama and Takano Sho, they're good. But not great, not a great start. Beats Wakataka Kage, beats Katonowaka, loses to Ichinojo, loses to Daishoho, beats Chiyoshima. Now, Chiyoshima was Maegashira 5, had no business being there. Like, that's just too high of a rank for him. Lost to Takayumi, beat Tamawashi, who ended up having a poor tournament, lost to Takakeisho, lost to Shodai. Now, at this point, he's 4-7. He's going to drop unless he wins his last 4. So who does he get? He beats Terano Fuji. Like, that's wild. After a tournament like that, and at the time, it was kind of like, holy cow, Terano Fuji's just going to blow him off the doyo. And then that absolutely did not happen. So good for him. He got his win. He was able to carry on with his attempt to save the Kachikoshi. And he did. He beat Takara Fuji, he beat Onisho, and he beat Myogiryu. Now, Onisho and Myogiryu were doing very, very well in that basho, but they were definitely a relatively low rank. We know Onisho is capable of being high Maegashira. They were both Maegashira 3 in this last tournament, so that's not like an upset. It wouldn't have been an upset if Onisho had won, but Myogiryu was overmatched. So that is another final match which saved the Kachikoshi that was not as hard as it could have been. Kyushu 2021. Well, this is where he slipped, and it was only 7-8, but again, let's go over it. Starts out, loses his first 2 to Maegashira wrestlers again, Takano Sho, Wakataka Kage. Got a little lucky. Okinoumi and Myogiryu at this point in their careers have no business being at Maegashira 3, but there they were, and he slapped the hell out of them. Got a win against Kirabayama, who was doing god-awful at that point in time. A loss to Daishoho, a loss to Onisho, beat Takara Fuji. Like, all of this is fairly standard. Loses to Takayumi, who ends up having a great tournament. Beats Takakeisho. Like, he had another good win. He seems to always have at least one good win in these tournaments. Loses to Shodai, loses to Terano Fuji, who, beat everybody, so no shame there. Loses to Endo, and then gets Ura, who was, again, having a great tournament, but Maegashira 7, and as I've said in other videos, Ura is not at this Sekiwake level. He's not at that high Maegashira level. And then he got a good win against Ichinojo, who was struggling. Everything was done. They were both Makikoshi. It looks better to go 7-8 than 6-9, but again, he lost the rank. And then Hatsu 2022, down at Komusubi. This one went all wrong. Loses to Tamawashi, gets a good win against Takakeisho, gets a good win against Ichinojo, 2-1, loses to Takayumi, but everyone sees Takayumi as just steamrolling people. Okay. Beats Ura, who's doing really poorly, but ends up doing okay for the tournament. So he's 3-2 at this point. But then he gets beat by Wakataka Kage, who, as we've seen, was at this point starting to get on a really good roll. Lost to Takano Sho, who was still doing okay at this point. Lost to Kirabayama, who didn't have a great tournament. Beat Shodai, but Shodai was terrible this time. Lost to Endo, who was doing god-awful. Lost to Hokuto Fuji, who was not doing well. somehow beat Terunofuji and was in fact the reason Terunofuji got hurt and wasn't doing well for the end of the tournament, but then lost to Takara Fuji, who was doing okay, but, you know, Maegashira 7, lost to Onisho, lost to Daishoho. So what we're seeing across these 4 tournaments is a guy who is capable of beating any of the Rikishi at this level, but also very capable of losing to them, and maybe not capable of maintaining the winning records necessary to hold on to these higher ranks. I would not be the least bit shocked if we see him return to High Maegashira, but consistently be in that sort of Ichinojo territory. Did I say Ichinojo? Ichinojo territory, where he's kind of pressing for Sanyaku, but mostly staying around 2, 3, 4, that kind of rank. It's entirely possible that he's simply not as good as even that, and this 1 in 14, obviously that in and of itself is an aberration, but if he gets back to that, you know, 1, 2, 3 Maegashira range, he's going to have losing records. We might see 8 and 7s, but we might also see 5s and 10s, or 5 and 10s. It's hard to say at this point. I would say that if he drops into the Maegashira 11 and under bracket, so 11 through 17, he's probably going to be a decent choice unless we get word of an injury definitely hindering him. If he somehow only drops to like Maegashira 10, I would not select him for the next basho. So that'll do it for our statistical look at Meisei, his 1 in 14 basho, and what we might be able to expect from him in the future. Unfortunately, he's in such a realm of his own at this point with his performance over the last couple years that it's hard to pull data from Sumo's history and figure out how he's likely to do going forward. Injury news is probably going to be most telling in that respect, but I really hope that as this series moves forward and we find more subjects to tackle, we'll find more and more data that points us in a good direction towards interesting ideas and good predictions that help us look real smart to all our sumo-loving friends. So that'll do it for now. We'll see you next time and have a great day.